pandemic. Since day one, our government has been engaging with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation leaders in the fight against this virus. We've been listening to people's concerns and working with local leadership to ensure that communities are getting the right support. And so far, we've taken a number of important steps. We're investing in emergency shelters to help Indigenous women and children fleeing violence. We're offering interest-free loans and non-repayable contributions to help Indigenous businesses weather this storm. We're helping First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation students and recent grads find a job this summer. And last week, we announced more funding to support the most urgent needs of Indigenous communities dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak. While all communities have had to wrestle with COVID-19 these past few months, the everyday realities of this crisis are different for everyone. To mount an effective response to this crisis, we must adapt our approach and our programs to recognize and meet the particular needs of all Indigenous peoples, including those living in urban areas and off-reserve. To this end, we announced $15 million back in March to support Indigenous organizations that deliver services to these populations as part of the Indigenous Community Support Fund we had set up to help prevent and mitigate the impact of this virus. With this money, organizations have been able to give meals, groceries, clothing, and supplies to those in need and offer mental health counseling. They've also provided personal protective equipment and cleaning supplies for supportive housing and computer and laptops so kids can keep up with their schoolwork. This funding is helping vulnerable people like youth, women, and elders. Indigenous community organizations in our cities and off-reserve do crucial work year-round, but these days their services are in high demand because of the pandemic. We need to make sure they have the resources to adapt and grow their services so they can fulfill their important mission. So today, our government is announcing an additional $75 million in new funding for organizations that address the critical needs of the over 1 million Indigenous people living in urban centres and off-reserve. This is critical work. If you live off-reserve or in a city, we're working to make sure you don't fall through the cracks. You need and deserve services that are culturally appropriate, and that's what we're doing with today's investment.
Today, our government is announcing a new investment of $75 million for organizations that address the most urgent needs of more than 1 million Indigenous people living in urban centres or off-reserve. This is money that community organizations will be able to use to combat food insecurity, support vulnerable seniors, help young people at risk, provide mental health services, and prevent family violence. Now, I would like to directly address employers and property owners. We've been talking a lot about reopening the economy these days, and that's good news for everyone. But if you've had to slow down or stop your activity in recent months, reopening will also present certain challenges. So we are putting measures in place to support you. If you need help to rehire your employees, you can use the emergency wage subsidy. We have just extended that program until the end of the summer. If you're experiencing liquidity problems or if you have expenses to take on, you can receive a loan through the emergency business account. If you're not eligible for those two programs, we invite you to address or go directly to your regional development agency. They will be able to help you. We are also working with the provinces, the territories, and property owners and their tenants to try and lower rents for small businesses. Owners can apply starting on Monday on the website of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Agency. We're all anxious to see life return to normal, but in order for that to happen, everyone must do their part, and employers in particular have an important role to play. When people are thinking of a return to normalcy, one of the first things that comes to mind is going back to work. It's about finding a certain amount of financial stability, seeing their colleagues and friends again, and getting back into their routine. Your employees are counting on you, your community as well. So if you need help, but you're not sure where to start, please go to canada.ca and consult the COVID-19 page. There you will find more information about all the programs available to you and how to go about getting that support. We are preparing to restart our economy, and I know that together we can come back strong once the crisis is over.
As we gradually and carefully restart some activities, it's never been more important to follow public health instructions. COVID-19 remains a very serious health threat. Yesterday, Dr. Tam said that whenever physical distancing is not possible, Canadians should wear a non-medical mask or face covering when they go out. I want to remind everyone that physical distancing means keeping a 2-meter distance with others. As we start to reopen the economy, it might be more difficult to maintain that distance at all times, so please follow Dr. Tam's advice. Keep washing your hands, stay home, and if you need to, wear a mask. This is the best way to protect both yourself and others.
As we start to gradually reopen the economy, it's important to remember that COVID-19 remains a serious threat to health. Yesterday, Dr. Tam said that Canadians should wear a non-medical mask when they cannot keep a distance of 2 meters from others. As we start to reopen the economy, it could become more difficult to follow the rules involving physical distancing. So it's important to continue Dr. Tan's instructions. Wash your hands, stay home, and, if necessary, wear a mask. That is the best way to protect our health and the health of others.
I want to end today with a piece of good news. Today, more than 230 new officers are graduating from the Royal Military College of Canada. They are part of a new generation of exceptional women and men ready to serve our country with distinction. You have chosen to step up and serve your country, and we could not be more proud of you. Thank you for your example. Thank you for your dedication. Thank you for your love of this extraordinary country, and mostly, thank you for everything you will do for us in the coming years. Congratulations to the class of 2020. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. On va commencer la conférence de presse avec le téléphone aujourd'hui. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Merci. The first question, Janie Kashagamskam, APTN, line open.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. This question, I know I talked about it yesterday, about communities, about Indigenous communities protecting their members, specifically in Manitoba's Kiosk Dam. You have Fox Lake creating another blockade. And I'm wondering, do you think, specifically Fox Lake, do they have the right to protect their community members like this?
I think every community needs to make sure they're taking decisions to protect their members, but I think there are many ways of going about it. We need to make sure that all different orders of government, including Indigenous governments, are working together with the same goal, which we all share, which is keeping Canadians as safe as possible, recognizing that certain communities and certain individuals are more vulnerable. And I certainly know that across the country there have been excellent and constructive conversations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous leadership in areas of overlap so that we can move forward in a way that protects Canadians but also allows for a progressive return to normality. Je pense que c'est extrêmement important.
I think it's extremely important that in every community the right decisions are made to keep citizens safe. I know that across the country there are Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities that are close by or adjacent, and they are talking about the best way to protect their citizens, particularly at a time when there's talk of reopening the economy. But we all share the same desire, which is to mitigate the expansion and the spread of COVID-19 and to keep our citizens, particularly the most vulnerable, safe. And I know that that's what we will continue to do.
Yes, thank you. And again, I know I spoke to you about this yesterday, but my next question is again concerning early releases of prisoners. And more specifically, we at APTN, we've been asking Bill Blair for about a month now for the number of released inmates that have been released early from federal prisons. We've been trying quite unsuccessfully, but I'm wondering, do you have can you confirm that inmates are being released early, and do you know when we'll get these numbers?
Corrections Canada has from the very beginning taken extremely seriously the responsibility of keeping both inmates and staff safe in their institutions during this pandemic. They have taken a number of steps in terms of reducing mobility between prisons, increasing the access for protective measures, and in certain cases looking at release conditions. Minister Blair will have more to answer on that.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Stuart Thompson, National Post. Line open.
Hi, Prime Minister. Thanks for taking the question. I'm just hoping to get a sense of your government's thinking around a potential second wave of infections in the fall. I know there's some concern in provincial governments that Canadians might not take to a second lockdown, or maybe even a third or a fourth if it comes to that. Could be for mental health reasons or economic security reasons, or just a kind of exhaustion. So I'm just curious, is this something that you are also worried about?
I think one of the things we know is that in pandemics there are usually second waves. The question that we're very much focused on is, as that second wave begins, or as we start to see resurgences in a reopened economy, how quickly are we able to contain them and control them? And that comes down to the scale of testing, the scale of contact tracing we're able to have right across the country. That's why the federal government has stepped up in its offer to provinces to support them in massively scaling up testing capacity and contact tracing capacity. We know, particularly in those areas that are still working to get the spread of the virus under control, it is going to be important to increase testing now, as we're seeing in those areas, but also make sure that as we move forward through the summer and obviously into the fall, we are ready to act extremely quickly so that the population at large won't be in situations of having to go back into confinement. But that depends on citizens doing their part. It also depends on having that testing capacity, and that's what we're moving forward on.
As a follow-up, Stuart?
Yeah, so there have been some countries that even in the first wave have managed to fend off a large amount of infections without a lockdown. I'm thinking of Hong Kong, where they've had barely any deaths, and it's mainly because of mask wearing and a really robust centralized quarantine. And I'm curious if your government has been exploring these other jurisdictions and maybe some other ideas that would allow you to hold off on a lockdown if infections do raise again?
From the very beginning, we have been looking carefully at what other countries have done and drawing from them on elements that we could put forward in our response that would help here in Canada. Obviously, there are many lessons, most many countries around the world got serious in their situations before we did, so we were able to make some very smart choices early on that has largely kept the pandemic within controllable levels in Canada, although there have still been far too many deaths, and we certainly grieve and mourn all of those. We know that there is more to do, and as we reopen, we know that citizens will continue to be extremely vigilant and careful about how they act, because that is going to be a key part of keeping us safe moving forward. So government will do its part, citizens, employers, employees will be doing their part. We need to continue to do everything we can to prevent the need for any further lockdowns the way we've had up till now.
Right from the outset, we've been looking at what other countries were doing in order to learn from those measures that could help us in Canada. And we did take inspiration from some of those measures while adapting them to our own reality. Now, as we move towards a more and more open and active economy, we will need to continue to remain vigilant as a government and have an increased capacity to test and do contact tracing. But at the same time, we expect Canadian citizens to do their part as well. I know they don't want to end up in isolation once again. And whether people are wearing masks or keeping their distance from others or washing their hands regularly or being careful and employers doing their part, all of those things will be very important in terms of our ability to manage a further wave of infection and without our having to go through what we've been through in the last few months.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Michel Lamarche, TVA. À vous.
TVA. Good morning. I'd like you to comment on private day camps. We're hearing that 71% of them believe that without financial assistance from the federal government, they will have to shut down. Now, the economy is starting to reopen. Do you have any intention of helping these day camps? Well, I think that day camps and other organizations will have to make their own decisions in order to keep Canadians safe. That's their top priority. But there are many industries and many sectors of the economy that will have trouble this summer because of the lack of tourism, because of the lack of travel, and because of COVID-19. And the federal government and provincial governments will have to reflect on how we can ensure that we don't damage the economy too much, because we need to ensure there can be a strong recovery once this is over. Follow-up? Yes, of course, but at the same time, to what extent do you feel that with the reopening of the economy, those camps are important not only for the children and teenagers that work there, but also for the parents? Now, if the wage subsidy criteria were relaxed, that would help those people to hire more monitors. Are you prepared to take that step? Well, I think there is some regional reflection that has to happen, and from the very beginning we've seen that COVID-19 spreads more readily in camps or in institutions where people spend the entire day working close by other workers. And of course, I think the owners of these day camps will have to reflect on this and remain very diligent in their thinking. I'm not sure what those decisions will be, but I think that people are under a lot of pressure from parents, of course, who would like to be able to send their children to these camps, but they're also concerned about the safety of their children. And these are all things we're going to have to think about in the coming weeks.
Last question.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir. À vous.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to come back to the issue of airline companies. We recently saw that Air Canada had lost $2.6 billion in tickets that were bought that were not refunded. The same with Air Transat. So when will your government provide some conditional support to those airlines as long as they refund travelers? I know that there are many Canadians out there who are concerned about the money they've already spent on airline tickets and that they're not obviously going to be able to use. We also realize that the airline sector is vulnerable and that it's facing major challenges. We also know that Canadians have economic concerns, so we will be working with the sector and airlines and Canadians who are worried to try and find some solutions.
I think we recognize how impacted air travel and airlines are by this COVID-19 pandemic. We also recognize that many Canadians are out of pocket for tickets that they are obviously not going to be using. I think we need to have some very careful discussions with airlines, with the air travel sector, and indeed with Canadians who are concerned to try and figure out a way forward where we can ensure that Canadians are treated fairly and our airline industry remains there for when our economy picks up again.
I understand what you're saying, but could you be a bit more clear about this? You say you're seeking solutions, but among those solutions, could you demand that the airlines refund Canadians? Well, we are looking at what other jurisdictions and other countries are doing. We are currently talking to the airlines as well, and we've heard Canadians' concerns. We know that they want to be refunded their money, but they also want us to have an airline industry in future, so because we'll need it, and so that balance will be very important.
Canadians both want to make sure they're not out of pocket, but they also want to know that we do have a future for our airline industry in Canada. It's an important thing for Canadians to continue to have airlines in this country. We need to make sure we're getting that balance right, and we're making it through this in the right way.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Perry, CBC. We've seen some shortfalls in testing in places like Ontario and Quebec. You've just said that the federal government offering to invest in a national framework to lead the way on testing and contact tracing. You've got a call with the premiers today. Presuming if they do take you up on your offer, how fast could you roll this out? What's standing in your way? And given the shortfalls we're seeing in places like Ontario and Quebec, should they feel safe as these economies reopen?
We have already seen significant ramp-ups of testing in places like Ontario and Quebec, where there is a need for even greater testing. Last week with the premiers, I laid out that offer that the federal government could take it on, and we got positive responses from right across the country. We're going to continue discussing that tonight and talk precisely about how we can scale up testing immediately in places where it's necessary, like in Ontario and Quebec, and be ready to scale up almost instantly in places where right now the virus is pretty well under control, but any flare-ups need to be responded to extremely quickly. That is the frame that we're laying out. We don't want logistical or financial limitations to keep anywhere in this country held back from doing all the testing that is necessary. That's what the federal government will be there for. We
know that we need to do more testing and more contact tracing, particularly in Ontario and Quebec. But I just want to say that there has been a large increase in the testing that has been conducted recently, and we will continue to do that. We know it's important to ramp up the amount of testing that's being done, and the federal government will be there with resources and equipment for that to happen, just as we've been doing now for several weeks. But there are also different situations. Now, right now in Quebec and Ontario in particular, they need to ramp up their testing immediately. But there are other places in Canada where the need is not there now for more testing because the situation is pretty much under control. But they have to be ready to immediately do a lot more testing if there's a resurgence of the infection in one location or another of COVID-19. And the federal government will be there to support the provinces to get that done.
The Premier says that he wants a national policy on paid sick leave, says it's a crucial part of preventing that second wave of COVID-19. You've got economies opening up, you've got a lot of low-wage workers finding it hard to take sick leave. So would you be willing to look at a national policy on that?
We have already had good conversations on a range of proposals by the provinces. I've heard John Horgan, Premier of BC, directly on this proposal, and look forward to continuing conversations with the provinces on how we can best support people. There's the issue of sick leave, there's the issue of increased childcare spaces, there's the issue of making sure our long-term care facilities are better supported and more protected. There are a number of things that we need to talk about as governments to ensure that we're moving forward in the right way.
Prime Minister Janet Silver, Global News. Canada's spy agency CSIS is warning of a national risk posed by foreign investments. Plus, there are threats from foreign actors to manipulate the Canadian public and interfere with our democracy. I'm wondering, how concerned are you about these reports, and what actions are your government taking to mitigate these concerns?
Our national security agencies do an exceptional job in flagging risks to Canadians and taking action to mitigate those risks. We will always support them and take on their recommendations and make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect Canadians from malicious actors, whether they be foreign or domestic.
Our security agencies play a critical role in making us aware of threats to Canada and Canadians, and the federal government always follows their recommendations and works with them to ensure the safety and integrity of our systems in Canada.
On the West Block, we spoke to China's ambassador to Canada, and when we asked him about the detainment of the two Michaels detained in China, Michael Spavor and Michael Korvic, he said that they were being treated very well. And then he went on to say, and I quote, that actually the biggest issue in our bilateral relationship is still Meng Wanzhou case. So that's why we have made it our position very clear, to make sure that she's back in China smoothly and safely. So the ambassador has linked her case to the two Michaels. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
We have seen Chinese officials linking those two cases from the very beginning. Canada has an independent judicial system that functions without interference or override by politicians. It is one of the things that is deeply dear to Canadians in our system to keep it strong and to assure the division of powers within our democracy. China doesn't work quite the same way and don't seem to understand that we do have an independent judiciary from political intervention. We will continue to follow and uphold the independence of our judicial system while we advocate for the release of the two Michaels who have been arbitrarily detained by China in retaliation for a judicial system that is independent in the way it functions. Le Canada a un système
Canada has a fully independent judiciary, and that is not exactly the same case in China, and they do not understand that we have no intention of interfering in our judicial system, which is an independent one. It's very important that we defend our values and democratic principles, and we will always do that. So the fact that China is still refusing an independent judicial process and tying that to the arbitrary detention of the two Michaels. Unfortunately, that is a challenge that we are working on and have been for a number of months now. Louis Bouin, Radio-Canada. There are tens of cases of fraud where people are using personal information to open a bank account, and then they request the emergency benefit in the name of that person. What about the extent of that fraud problem, and what can you do in concrete terms right now to stem that kind of fraud? Well, in this situation, we quickly understood that we had to take quick action to help the millions of Canadians who have lost their job because of COVID-19, that would not have any money to pay for their groceries or to pay their rent. It was an emergency. So we introduced measures where we could quickly provide money to millions of Canadians, and more than 8 million Canadians have received the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Now, we knew right away that there was a possibility that some individuals would try to defraud the government, and we put in place measures, not in order to filter applications right away, because that would have slowed down the delivery of that money for months and months. But we introduced measures to detect and recover that money as the pandemic continues. And I can assure you that the Canada Revenue Agency and the public service are working hard to ensure that there are consequences and that we can recover the money from people who defrauded the system. Fraud is unacceptable, and there will be consequences. There are members of the Mohawk community that are blocking the Oka National Park. I'd like to hear your reaction to that. Is it up to members of that community to take that kind of action, and are you afraid that things might go off the rails? Well, I think, first of all, it's important to understand that we're all seeking the same thing. We want to protect our citizens from COVID-19 and ensure the safety and security of everyone, including and especially vulnerable populations. The government and Indigenous governments have to work together to ensure that we're making the appropriate decisions to protect citizens, even as we try to return to normality with a more open economy. And I think that leadership in these various communities should get together and agree on the best way to do that.
I think it's extremely important that, first of all, we understand we all want the same thing. Every different order of government wants to ensure that citizens, particularly our vulnerable elders and vulnerable citizens, are protected. That's why different orders of government, including Indigenous governments, need to work with nearby communities and ensure that we're finding a balance that protects the citizens first and foremost, but allows for the careful reopening as appropriate of our economies and our communities.
Glenn McGregor, CTV News. Prime Minister, I want to ask you about the airline tickets again, because your two previous responses were not clear. The federal government is the regulator of Canada's airlines. Will you use that power and authority over them to insist the people who paid for tickets and were not given refunds get those refunds?
This is an important issue to Canadians that we are working with the airlines and with Canadians concerned on. We're looking at what other countries have done in these measures, and we're looking to make sure that Canadians are supported financially through this time, but that also we're going to come back with airlines that function here in Canada for the long term. Getting that balance right will be delicate, but it is something that we're working on.
But, Prime Minister, don't you see this as fundamentally unfair that people bought tickets, may never be able to use them, and are now given vouchers instead that they can't use? Don't you just think it's a matter of fairness and it's the right thing to do, whatever the issues the airline industry is facing right now?
This is why we are working with all concerned parties to try and find a solution. Merci tout le monde.
Merci.
That is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Thursday with